Alright, we're going to jump into Chapter 3 here, and I've done something a little bit different this time because Chapter 3, I don't really want to have you watch 3 separate videos for 3 separate sections, so I've combined 2 of the sections, the lessons, so you see Lesson 1 here, and then Lesson 2 follows in this video. So it might go a little bit longer than usual, it might be around 15 minutes, that's my max though, I'm not going over that. So let's dive right in here and get to it. I'm going to skip past kind of learning targets just to get to what we're focusing on here. World population. World population is, in the 1800s, it was about 860 million people lived in the world. By the 1900s, we're up to 1.7 billion, and 2012 it was 7 billion, even higher than that today in 2017. So the population of the world keeps rising. Areas get more crowded. Main factors that influence why population is so large is that the overall global death rate has fallen. People are living longer. Not as much disease, or if there is disease, it can be either cured with medicines or it can be prevented with vaccinations. But the overall birth rate is higher than the death rate, so there's more babies being born than there are people dying. And so that's why the population continues to rise around the world. So moving on to the next slide. Some countries are doubling in size and population. And this is kind of a serious problem. You know, it's a good thing that people aren't dying off, but also at the same time, when things become overcrowded, resources become scarce, and there's just not enough resources to go around. It says that here that the population will peak around 9 billion, according to the United Nations here. That's probably about what the Earth has the capacity to withstand, just based on areas available for farmland to produce food, and space available for adequate living. So, kind of interesting that we're kind of approaching that number. This is a population pyramid. It's worth knowing and understanding kind of how this works. So often, when you see a country that forms more of a pyramid, this one does not. This is the U.S. population, and even still called a population pyramid. But notice how really you don't see a sharp drop-off in the bar graph until the upper part here. What this means is that most ages have a fairly long, or at least people have a long life expectancy. It's not until, we see like 80 to 85 does it really start to drop off, maybe 75 to 79. In other countries, you're going to see it taper off much more in this area right here, halfway down, and it very much looks like a pyramid. The U.S. being a country that has high socioeconomic status for most people, poverty is fairly low. There's government assistance where there is poverty, means that people live longer. In countries like Africa, you might not see people live nearly as long. Some places in Asia, it's the same way. So this is kind of some of the things I already talked about. When population grows, cities become overcrowded, diseases can spread quickly. This is a big problem in Africa. You've probably heard of like the Ebola outbreak a couple of years ago. Some of that is due to overcrowding. It's also due to like lack of clean water, and some of that again is, if everybody needs access to water, some people just don't have clean water. So crime can increase, pollution can increase. We see that in a lot of the major cities in the United States, where there's a lot of smog and things like that. So there definitely is problems there. There can be harmful effects on the global environment, needing more resources. A lot of places suffer from deforestation today, so cutting down of trees, mining, just trying to get more resources to sustain that population that is growing so large. Alright, moving on here, some of the things we're doing to kind of combat that, using other alternative forms of energy, such as solar panels, using wind, water, solar, I already said solar, geothermal energy sources, because burning fossil fuels eventually will run out, right? Coal will run out. So trying to find options besides that. Reading through this slide here, see if there's anything I really want to cover. I don't think there's really anything here that we'll kind of focus on. Population distribution just kind of focuses on where people are at. population density. So this is kind of directly a part of population. So population density is how many people live within a square mile. Cities have a higher population density than rural areas of the country. What we're seeing though as population rises, population density is increasing too, and there's some places that just are so large, there's just not enough resources to go around. So you need to know the definition of population density. This kind of shows that, so you can kind of see the areas that are red over here. This is showing elevation on the left, physical map, but this one over here, the darker colors are showing higher populations. And you're going to see that more around cities that you've heard of. Some of this being in southern Africa, maybe areas you're not familiar with. So urban areas are densely populated, rural areas are sparsely populated. You know, we on the edge of the city of Bloomington, we're kind of a mixture. You know, we're not really urban in the same way you would define urban like Indianapolis or even Bloomington, but we're not really rural either. So it's kind of a mixture of both in our school system. Remember that land covers about 30% of the Earth's surface and only about 15% of it is inhabitable. So it means 70% is covered in water. You know, yeah, you might say build, stilts and live in there, but even if it's surrounded by ocean and it's not in the middle of nowhere, you can't really live there. So there's been some building on ocean, of course, but most of the time people live on land that exists. But some of it, about half of what's habitable, is either desert or too cold and just not really habitable year-round. So people are migrating, moving from one place to another. An immigrant means to leave one's home and live in another place. So this happens all the time. And causes of that migration, the reasons for leaving one area and going to another could be a lot of push-pull factors. Push factors means they are driven away from their country by war, violence, persecution, natural disasters, or the lack of jobs. Pull factors, they're attracted to certain things. This include family, friends, better education, better jobs. So often when we see maybe foreign people living in this country, they could have been coming here because they had better opportunities for higher wages here. Maybe they had family already here, so those would be pull factors. And then push factors, what if they came from someplace like Syria that's been going through a lot of conflict and war, trying to escape that and come to this country would be the factors leading to that. So lots of people immigrate for a lot of different reasons. This is kind of a video on that, so we're going to skip by that. Kind of elaborates on the very same things that I just talked about. So the movement of people to and from different parts of the world can affect the land, resources, and cultures. We've already kind of talked about this. It can affect making cultural blending, which means that cultures mix together and influence each other. So, even maybe your own heritage. Maybe you have Mexican heritage that is, along with American heritage. So you might kind of blend certain things together and certain practices in your families. Can be blends of those types of things. And some people are trying to work to maintain and preserve the original culture. And often in a lot of places, some people are losing their culture. I used to live in Montana, and I lived on an Indian reservation. And when I lived there, one of the things, the native language was kind of like going extinct. No one could really speak it anymore except some older people that had grown up with it. And so there was a big effort to reintroduce that language to teach that. Because it's not being taught in schools, things like Spanish and French and maybe German are, but like other languages aren't necessarily doing that. So the blending can lead to the loss of some cultural components. Urbanization is the rise of cities, cities getting bigger. This can lead to a megalopolis, which is a huge city or cluster. So sometimes, when you have other things around the city, it just makes for a massive area. So the city isn't just necessarily like Los Angeles or Minneapolis or something like that. It may be other areas that are connected around that where you're outside the city, but it still feels like you're there. So megalopolis is these large cities, and urbanization is kind of what leading to their creation. So that kind of wraps up the first part. Now I'm going to use the second part here, and I've only got about 5.5 minutes to go through world cultures. But I think some of this is kind of an overlap, so we're going to kind of skip through some of these slides. Just think about what culture is. Culture is the set of beliefs, behaviors, and traits shared by a group of people. So we have lots of cultural practices. As we already said, that there's a cultural blend. Sometimes we have ties. Miss Epperson, for example, is American, but she also has Japanese culture as well. And so she draws from both of those experiences. And you might be able to identify with that as well, having certain experiences that draw from multiple cultures. So these are the 8 cultural traits. These are the things that kind of permeate all cultures. Things like religion, language, arts and sports, government, economics. Those are things that almost every culture has, whether it's a small culture or a big culture, it doesn't really matter. All those things seem to be present. A social group is people that interact. An ethnic group is a group of people with a common racial or national, tribal, or religious connection. So, at school, you kind of more identify with social groups, but ethnic groups would be identified, based on other components. This sometimes, it's definitely present in the United States, but maybe we don't acknowledge that as much. We more focus on the social groups, just because the United States is such a melting pot anyway. So there's definitely a blending of those types of things. Language, I'm not going to kind of elaborate. You can kind of look through the website and look at some of these slides, but languages are something that obviously unite us, and we pass on beliefs through that language. Religion, we're going to talk a lot about religion this year. You can see some of the kind of the information here, but it's the traditions, and so we're going to talk about some of these major religions that you're seeing listed down here at the bottom. But that's definitely something that influences the beliefs of a culture. And then there's the customs. So you see someone bowing there, a handshake. Certain things are a part of certain cultures. Some cultures maybe you've seen like the kissing of the cheeks. Those are just practices that are done. And so that helps us kind of maybe classify an area. And then we also factor in history and how history relates into a culture and helps tell that story. Arts and sport, almost every, society has some sort of arts and sports a part of that, whether it's a tribe in Africa or a major country like Russia or China. They also engage in those types of sports. So lots of examples there of Miss Epperson. She created the slides, and then I'm obviously narrating through these. So government, we'll talk a lot about government this year as well, and the institutions of that. Some examples are democracy, monarchy, and dictatorship. And then we have economy. Now the next video segment I'm going to give you is going to talk about the various types of economies, but you see some of the different types hopefully listed here, but how goods and services are distributed and produced is factors into this as well. And some countries have a stronger economy than others. And then we have regions, that's a component of that, so we can help identify commonality among the different regions. So kind of defining these three terms right here, and then I'll try to wrap up with that. Democracy is a system of government that is run by the people. And so the people elect someone. That's an example of that. We in the United States have what is called a representative democracy because we don't make decisions directly. We elect a president, we elect Senate, we elect Congress, and they make decisions on our behalf. And most countries have this because government by the people, we're all too busy doing other things to go and constantly vote. A monarchy, which you learned about last year, especially when you studied Europe, kings and queens. They have usually ultimate power, but today we often have constitutional monarchy. In a constitutional monarchy, the king and queen is limited in power in a lot of ways. The Queen of England is not considered all-powerful. Actually, more power rests somewhere else. So a constitutional monarchy is more common. We do have some, like in Saudi Arabia, there are absolute monarchies where the ruler does have absolute authority. A dictatorship. We'll talk about a couple of dictatorships this year, such as North Korea has a dictator, and they have one for many years, so we see that mentioned here. A dictatorship is a form of government in which a person has absolute power to rule, and then they usually maintain power kind of by force in a lot of ways. Usually the military is on their side. So there's 3 different videos here you could check out in the actual slides if you wanted to see them. That kind of compares these. And then kind of wrapping up here, I know I'm down to my last 45 seconds. So globalization, the process by which nations and cultures and economies become integrated or mixed. We've already kind of acknowledged that, and there's some negative and positive effects of that. And that does look like the last slide. So I have finished 2 sections in less than 15 minutes. Yay rah for me. So that is kind of wraps this up. There will be some questions embedded, so make sure you answer those. And that will be it until we get to lesson 3 about economies.